It was a stormy night, one of those where the air feels thick with the scent of rain before the downpour finally arrives. Dark clouds swirled above, rumbling with thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. The distant flashes of lightning cast eerie, jagged shadows, momentarily illuminating the McDonald's parking lot. It was nearly deserted, just a few cars parked under flickering streetlights, their headlights barely visible through the curtain of rain beginning to fall. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it a faint rumble of thunder, a warning that the worst of the storm was about to hit. Beyond the lot, dense bushes and a steep ravine disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the storm's ominous quiet. I was used to the quiet eeriness of late-night shifts, used to the solitude and the strange, unpredictable rhythm of working through the night. As a night shift worker at McDonald's, I had plenty of time to myself. I spent my breaks listening to true crime podcasts, a habit that had made me naturally observant. I'd seen my fair share of odd customers over the years. People with strange habits, people who didn't quite fit in. But tonight, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made my skin prickle, and the stillness of the night seemed too sharp, too unsettling. It was just before midnight when the door opened and the two men stepped inside. I barely looked up from wiping down the counter as they walked in, but something about their presence made me take notice. One was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, the hood pulled low over his face, while the other had an oversized jacket on, the kind that looked too heavy for the humid night. Despite the warmth and the coming storm, they seemed overdressed, and that alone set my nerves on edge. They made their way to the counter, speaking in low voices, their conversation so quiet that it felt like they were trying to keep it from being heard. I didn't catch all of it, but I noticed the way they glanced around often, like they were worried about being watched. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. People act strange all the time, especially at night. But these two had an air about them, an urgency to their movement that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took their order, pretending not to notice how they kept looking over their shoulders, their eyes darting to the windows, scanning the empty parking lot outside. I handed them their food, a feeling of unease growing in my gut, but I said nothing. I was just a worker. I had no reason to ask questions. Still, something about them unsettled me. The storm was picking up now. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, splattering onto the pavement, darkening the surface in quick splotches. Thunder growled in the distance, and I could feel the storm building, the way the pressure in the air seemed to weigh heavier with every passing minute. It was only a matter of time before the downpour would hit. The men finished their meal quickly, barely speaking to each other. They looked around one last time before standing up and heading for the door. I watched them walk toward their car parked near the ravine, my gaze lingering on them as they stepped out into the growing rain. Just as they reached their car, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the lot. For a split second, the harsh light cut through the darkness, casting long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. I saw them open the trunk of their car, and my stomach sank as I watched them struggle with something large and heavy, trying to pull it out. The sack was awkward in their hands, too heavy, too cumbersome. They were careful with it, almost as if it were fragile, yet there was an urgency to the way they handled it, like they were afraid of being seen. My heart began to race as I realized just how strange it was. They weren't handling a bag of trash or an ordinary item. The way they moved, the way they made sure nobody could see what they were doing, it didn't sit right with me. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the sack swayed slightly in their grip. They paused, standing still for a moment as if exhausted by the effort. And then, almost in unison, they started to push it toward the bushes near the ravine. I could feel the tension building in my chest. My instinct screamed at me to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Watching as the men moved in eerie silence, trying to dispose of whatever was inside that sack. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my hands were starting to tremble. It felt like everything in the world had gone still, except for the beating of my heart and the distant growl of thunder. Just as they were about to shove the sack into the bushes, the storm seemed to pause. The wind died down for just a moment, and in that instant, a flash of lightning lit up the parking lot again. I saw him. One of the men suddenly turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine through the window. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Nobody moved. The only sound was the howl of the wind, the rustling of leaves. The man didn't flinch, didn't look away. He stared right at me, and I couldn't breathe. The sense of dread that I'd been fighting surged up in my chest, and I knew, without a doubt, that he saw me. Then, without a word, the men shoved the sack back into the trunk of their car. It was as if they had suddenly decided their plan had been interrupted, as if they were rushing to cover their tracks. The trunk slammed shut, and they jumped into the car, the engine roaring to life. The tires screeched as they sped away, vanishing into the rain-soaked darkness, leaving me standing there in the flickering light of the street lamp, my heart pounding. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaky as I reported the men, the sack, and everything I'd just seen. I told them where they'd parked, where they'd gone, but by the time the police arrived, the rain was pouring down in sheets, and the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the car, no trace of the sack. The officers searched the area, but they found nothing. The ravine was quiet, the bushes were undisturbed, and there was no trace of anyone having been there. I tried to explain what I had seen, but without evidence that they couldn't do anything. The men had disappeared as if they had never been there at all. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had been in that sack? What had they been trying to get rid of? I didn't know, and the answers remained hidden, swallowed by the stormy night. The only thing I could be sure of was that whatever they were doing, they didn't want anyone to know. It was a warm summer evening, and the golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows across the McDonald's parking lot. The late afternoon sunlight painted everything in soft tones of orange and amber, but the air had already started to cool. I stepped out of the car, feeling the warmth of the day still lingering in the pavement beneath my feet. It was one of those perfect summer evenings, the kind where everything seems calm and peaceful, the air filled with the smell of fresh fries and sizzling burgers from inside. My two kids were bouncing with excitement as they ran to the play area, their laughter already filling the air. The soft hum of the air conditioning inside McDonald's made the restaurant feel like a haven of coolness from the outside heat. The play area was alive with kids climbing through tunnels, racing down slides, and shouting to each other in a language only kids can understand. I grabbed an iced coffee and found a seat by the window, watching them play while I took a moment to relax. This was our routine. After school, when I didn't have too many deadlines or clients to juggle, I would take the kids to McDonald's for a small treat. A way to unwind from the stresses of the week and to give them a little joy after a long day of school. I was a freelance graphic designer, which meant I could set my own hours. It was the best of both worlds. I got to work from home and take care of the kids, but it also meant I had to keep a close eye on everything. Juggling deadlines and school pickups was a constant balancing act, but this little slice of normalcy made it feel worthwhile. The kids were so happy, so immersed in their games, and I couldn't help but smile at the sound of their carefree laughter. I took a sip of my iced coffee, letting the cold beverage soothe my dry throat. Everything felt perfect in that moment, like a snapshot of a normal, safe evening in the suburban bubble we had made our life. But something caught my attention. Something that made the perfect evening start to unravel. I noticed him sitting at a table by himself. A man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. There was nothing particularly odd about him at first glance. What made me notice him wasn't his appearance, but the fact that he was sitting alone, staring across the play area. He didn't have any food or drinks in front of him, and there was no child with him. He was just sitting there, watching. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was waiting for someone. His wife, his kids, whatever. McDonald's is a busy place after all, and not everyone who's there is there for the same reason. But then, I noticed something unsettling. He moved. It wasn't a casual shift of his seat. It was deliberate, purposeful. He stood up and moved a few tables closer to the play area, sitting down again, but this time closer to the edge. He still wasn't eating or drinking anything. His eyes never left the play area. I glanced over, then back at my kids, and felt a strange unease crawling up my spine. He wasn't interacting with anyone. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just watching. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I continued watching him, I felt a sense of discomfort I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting there. It was how he watched the kids. His eyes weren't wandering. They were focused. Every time one of the kids ran past, his gaze followed them, tracking their movements. It wasn't just casual observation. It felt deliberate, and it felt wrong. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a guy waiting for a friend or relative. But the longer I watched, the more unsettled I became. There was something in the way he held himself. His posture was too still, too rigid, like a predator waiting for an opportunity. I glanced around the room to see if anyone else noticed him, but the other parents were busy chatting, scrolling on their phones, or drinking their coffees. No one seemed to be paying attention. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but something kept drawing my gaze back to him. My stomach twisted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, he stood up again, slowly. He didn't rush. He walked toward the play area entrance, and his eyes never left the children. He didn't make eye contact with anyone else in the room. He didn't look at me, but his intent was clear. He was headed straight for the play area, and his focus was all on the kids. My heartbeat quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but everything in me screamed that something was off. I stood up without thinking, my body moving before my mind could catch up. I walked quickly to the counter, feeling the chill of the cool air conditioning brush past me as I crossed the restaurant. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight, my stomach in knots. I leaned in close to the nearest McDonald's employee, trying not to be too obvious. "There's a man sitting by the play area. He's been watching the kids for a while now. I'm not sure, but it feels strange. Can you check on him?" The employee glanced over toward the man, and then back at me with a confused look. I followed her gaze, and that's when I realized he was gone. He wasn't at the table he'd been sitting at. He wasn't standing by the play area. There was no sign of him. "Are you sure?" she asked, still looking around the restaurant. "He hasn't ordered anything?" I nodded, my heart racing. "Yes, I'm sure." She hesitated for a moment, but then she walked to the back to get the manager. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had to make sure someone else was aware. There was no logical reason for my unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, the manager returned with the security footage from the cameras. He played it back for me, but the man didn't show up. There was no sign of him sitting at any table, no trace of him moving toward the play area. It was as if he had never been there at all. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The security footage didn't show him, and yet, I had seen him with my own eyes. He had been there, and just like that, he had vanished. The manager apologized, but it didn't make sense. The whole situation felt so surreal. I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined it, that maybe he was someone else who had blended into the crowd, or maybe I had been mistaken. But that feeling in the pit of my stomach, the sense of something being wrong, didn't go away. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the images of the man's still gaze, his focus never leaving the kids. My mind kept returning to the feeling that something had been about to happen, something I had prevented, or at least interrupted. I didn't know if it was just a strange coincidence, or if I had really stopped something from happening. But the uncertainty lingered, and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man, the way he disappeared, and whether or not I had overreacted, or if, somehow, my instincts had been right. And the next day, I heard from a few parents I knew. They'd seen him too, always around the same time, always acting the same way, but no one could explain it.